Hello and welcome to episode 32 of Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill and this is the podcast dedicated to the journals of my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Scott, written in the 1840s about his travels firstly around Europe and then later on, well, the rest of the world, I suppose, but mainly Mexico. So if you're tuning in again, I'm glad that you are. Well done for coming back. Well done. That sounds like a sort of school teacher, don't I? Well done. Very well done there for coming back and listening to the podcast. But no, if you are listening again, it's great that you've gone to the trouble of doing so, and it's very much appreciated by me. And I hope you are enjoying it so far. And if you are, why not spread the word? Tell your friends, he said. The more listeners we can get, the better. I mean, that's the point of a podcast, really, isn't it? Otherwise, you're just screaming into the wind. Now, if you're tuning in for the first time, I hope you enjoy this episode that's going to commence from hereforth. From thenceforth, or hereforth? Or thereforth? Or whenceforth? I don't know. From now on. And hopefully it'll whet your appetite to listen to the rest of the series. And you can catch up when you have time on all William's travels, observations, experiences, etc. I had some nice feedback from people regarding the last episode, so thanks for that. It's always very welcome to get input from people who are listening. And I'll just say the usual things. If you do want to make contact with me, you can do either through the Twitter account or X account. I think we should just say X now, shouldn't we, really? The X account, formerly known as Twitter. That's what's said an awful lot at the moment, isn't it? X, formerly known as Twitter. Anyway, if you want to get in contact, you can go to Scottish Historic. That's at 3G Grand Tour. And you can leave a message there or a comment or whatever. I post stuff up on there about each episode. And various other things as well. Probably should do a bit more than I do, really, but there we are, never mind. You can also follow me on the podcast on a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. So that's a Facebook page where you can join and also message me or leave comments or whatever you want. If Facebook is more your bag, there's a Mastodon account, which is at Scotted at universadon.com. Quiet but intelligent people on there, I would suggest. I have got an Instagram account, but I haven't really started using that very much as yet. I don't know why. I find the thing with Instagram is because obviously it's a kind of visual medium. I find it a bit hard to know quite how to use it in terms of promoting the podcast. Probably missing a trick, but anyway. I should begin, I think, just by saying where we were at the last episode. So William, he's travelling with his family. He's finished his time working as an engineer on the railway in Italy, in Milan. They're now travelling back, and they've gone over the Alps. And they're making their way northwards. Is it northwards? Yes, of course it is. Northwards, up through Switzerland and into Germany, or Baden, because at that time Germany was still not a unified country, so it was the individual states like Baden that existed in Germany at the time. So in the last episode, they just got to Zurich, and William had spent some time in a very posh hotel, which is still there, called the Hotel Bauer. I think it's called the Hotel Savoy, but it's the same building and it's very much the same hotel, really. It was the first hotel, or posh hotel, in Zurich. Anyway, William's in there, enjoying his time, being waited on by the staff, who are very attentive and extremely multilingual as well, which impresses him immensely. And so the next episode begins really with him carrying on, really, saying a little bit more about Zurich. I don't know quite how much time he has in Zurich. Can't be very long. I don't know whether he spends about a day there, a day or two. I think William, as you'll hear in this episode, he does spend a bit of time wandering around Zurich, but I don't think it's extensive. And I suggest a lot of the stuff that he's talking about is stuff that he's adding from maybe notebooks or other reference books he might have had access to at the time. But anyway, he does explain quite a bit more about Zurich, and then basically he and his family continue their journey up through the rest of Switzerland, and they then cross the border into southern Germany, or Baden, and that's about the point where the episode ends this time around. So that's it really. As I say, it begins with William saying a little bit more about Zurich and also visiting a engineering company, which, as he's an engineer himself, he takes quite a lot of interest in. Hope you enjoy. Zurich contains a great many elegant shops, and numbers of elegant private residences, mostly standing detached and surrounded by gardens. Immense elm trees are also standing in many parts of the city. It was formerly strongly fortified, but nearly the whole of the ramparts have been levelled and partly laid out as public walks. In others, buildings have been erected on their site. A fine large building was nearly finished for an arsenal and a cannon foundry, as according to the Articles of the Swiss Confederation, all the cantons are obliged to furnish a certain quota of men, arms and ammunition for the general defence of the state. Not far from this building are two lofty mounds, once the site of two forts, but now planted with trees and furnished with seats that command a fine view of the city and the shores of the lake for many miles. In the afternoon I visited the large steam engine and machinery manufactory of Messrs. Escher. They employ about 1,500 hands, and it is a very respectable concern. The manager and a few of the principal workmen are English. Their turning lathes, planing machines and other tools are all of English manufacture. Well, if this ain't a pretty particular sample of the collective wisdom of old John Bull's land, I'm done. They prohibit the exportation of spinning machinery, but they allow all kinds of tools to go, and their best artisans along with them, to show the foreigner how to make them himself. Now, of my own knowledge, I know that the large flax mill building at Cassana in Lombardy, and mentioned a few pages back, that those parts of the machinery which were not allowed to be exported from England were actually furnished by this establishment. At the time of my visit, they was just on the point of finishing a large iron steamboat and a pair of 90-horsepower engines for the Austrian government on the Danube. This was the second of an order for 6. So this company was called Escher and T, founded in 1805. The river Limmat, being so very rapid and possessing such an immense volume of water, gives power from driving machinery to an unlimited extent. In fact, its banks for many miles is covered with mills and manufactories of various kinds. Zurich was the first city in Switzerland that separated from the Church of Rome and established the Protestant religion. Amongst its charitable foundations are orphan houses, a hospital for incurables, another for the sick of all nations, which generally contains between 600 and 700 patients, and the Almosenamt, or Foundation for the Poor, which puts out children as apprentices, and distributes money, clothes, blankets and bedding to the poor persons, not only of the city, but of the canton, to the amount of upwards of 5,000 sterling per annum. A Almosenamt is just like a German version of saying the word alms, so like an almshouse or almsman in the sense of charitable gift. Zurich, being one of the aristocratic cantons, has been much subject to insurrections. A formidable one took place as recently as the 6th of September 1839, in which the people took by assault the arsenal and town hall. The government was completely overthrown, and a provisional government, named the Constitution, revised, and the just rights of the people restored that had been encroached upon by the aristocratic party. The canton of Zurich is bounded by that of Thurgau and that of Aargau to the west. Its area, which rather exceeds 950 square miles, is somewhat smaller than the average size of an English county. The hills, which do not rise above 3,200 feet, are separated by beautiful valleys and lakes. Rich pastures and extensive orchards meet the eye of the traveller in every direction. The cattle are in general of good breed. Wine also is cultivated. The quality in certain tracts of favourable exposure is good, but in general it is thin and sharp. The manufacturers are mostly carried out by weavers in their own houses, to which are attached patches of land. The fabrics are chiefly cotton and light silk stuffs, linen, woolen and leather. Corn is imported, the produce being inadequate to the consumption. Zurich is 12 leagues southwest of Constance, population 14,500. March 22nd. Left Zurich at 7 in the morning for Freiburg and Karlsruhe. For the first 4 hours the country was pretty level and very thinly inhabited. At 11 we arrived at Schaffhausen, the capital of the canton of that name, and situated on the Rhine. This town owes its origin to the interruption of the navigation of that river by the celebrated cataract. So that's another word for waterfall. By the celebrated cataract of Laufen, of which the descent is 85 feet. These are actually now called the Rhine Falls. The town is about 1 league above it. Huts were at first constructed for the conveniency of unloading the boats, which by degrees has increased to a large and handsome town. It has a castle, a college with 9 professors, a gymnasium, a town library, theological library, town halls, etc. The principal manufacturers are silk, cotton and leather. This, though a frontier town, has no garrison, and the fortifications are weak. The Rhine, which is here 400 feet wide, is crossed by a wooden bridge. It was burnt by the French when they evacuated the town after being defeated by the Austrians in 1799, but is again rebuilt, nearly in the same state as before. Schaffhausen is 7 leagues north by east of Zurich. Population 7,000. The canton of Schaffhausen is small but picturesque. It lies on the right bank of the Rhine and is nearly surrounded by Baden and separated from the cantons of Zurich and Thurgau by the Rhine. Its superficial extent is 115 square miles, and its population amounts to 40,000 persons. Leaving Schaffhausen, we proceeded to Waldshut, a strong town in the Grand Duchy of Baden, in the circle of Wiesen, and one of 4 forest towns. It is situated on the Rhine at the entrance of the Black Forest. It is 6 leagues west-southwest of Schaffhausen. We had now left Protestant Switzerland and had entered into Catholic Baden. So basically he's crossing into the German border now, so from Switzerland into what would now be modern-day Germany, but at that time it was the state of Baden. And entered into the Catholic Baden, as we had abundant evidence at every step. Every village we passed through, and at every crossroads, there was a representation of the crucifixion. In fact, we had got into the headquarters of the Jesuits themselves. We was now traversing the part known as the Black Forest, which consists of a chain of mountains in the Grand Duchy of Baden and the Kingdom of Württemberg. It runs almost parallel with the Rhine, from south to north, often only about 15 miles from the river. It is about 85 miles long and is about 30 miles wide. The Danube rises in these mountains, as well as many other rivers. Those on the west side run into the Rhine, and those on the east into the Danube. In some parts the road wound up the steep sides of the mountain, descended into deep valleys, and at other times penetrated through dark and gloomy woods of pine. Some of the trees are an immense size and height, by far the largest I have ever seen growing in Europe. The raising of cattle is the principal branch of the industry here, carried out in this district. The ground is not fertile, and the inhabitants scattered over the mountains live extremely frugally, and are very industrious. Their manner of living, building their houses and cultivating their land is very peculiar. Till the 17th century there was no spirit of trade or industry amongst them, but the wars of that period developed it, and the manufacture of glass, straw hats, wooden clocks and other woodenware is now very important. They make annually more than 180,000 wooden clocks, the value of which amounts to over 500,000 guilders. Neustadt and Furtwangen are the central points of this singular commerce, which embraces all of Europe and extends even to America. From the north of Germany and from Havre they are exported to the United States. Of late the clocks have been much improved, and the correctness of some of them made of different woods in order to counteract the influence of the weather is surprising. Right, I'm going to break in here to say a few things about this section of the journal. The first thing I thought I'd discuss is this engineering firm that William goes to visit. He calls it Messrs. Escher, The actual name of the company was Escher Wyss, and in fact in the area where it used to have its factory, which is now all demolished, that area is called Escher Wyss, so it's named after the company. But they were a company that started in 1805 making machinery for the textile industry, and then they graduated onto other things such as steam turbines, and also they did a bit of shipbuilding as well. In the last episode I mentioned the two oldest paddle steamers that are still left on Lake Zurich, the Stadt Zurich and the Stadt Rapperswil, or City of Zurich, City of Rapperswil. So those two paddle steamers, which you can still journey on if you want to, in a kind of nostalgic way, sail around Lake Zurich. They were actually built by Escher Wyss in about, well, I think one was built in 1909 and the other one was 1914. So as I say, this company became more and more involved in engineering. One of the perhaps less pleasant things about them was that during the Second World War, they supplied the German army with flamethrowers. So, good and bad. Would that count as an ethical company now? We make flamethrowers. Probably doesn't quite pass the ethical company bar, does it? Anyway, the company doesn't exist anymore. It got swallowed up by Sulzer, which is an even bigger Swiss company, so they got amalgamated into that. There is a building still there, which was the shipbuilding site, and that is now used as a theatre, apparently, in Zurich. And it's funny, there's William describing this thing as he had done in earlier sections in the journal, when he's travelling down through France, about how it's madness in his eyes that John Bull or England is letting all these artisan engineers and certain tools be exported to our foreign competitors so they can beat us at our own game. I go into a bit more of a full description about that in episode 10, I think it was. So I go into quite a lengthy explanation of the whole trade situation and how certain machinery was able to be exported and some wasn't.
Sounds fascinating.
And once again, William in that example is complaining about it as a way of Great Britain being foolish in letting its industrial technology know-how being easily given to our competitors. Now, the next thing I thought I'd discuss, which William mentions in this bit of the journal, is what he describes as this uprising of people that happened quite recently in 1839, so just 2-3 years before William's in Zurich. It's actually what's known as the Zurich Putsch. So putsch is just another word for coup, really, like coup d'etat. So it's quite interesting to discuss it just because it shows the nature of some of the thought and society of Switzerland at that time and I suppose beyond. So as I mentioned before, there's quite a strong history of both Catholic and Protestant people living together in Switzerland, but as ever, this doesn't mean there weren't any tensions. There were between these two religious groups. And this is a sort of case in point because Zurich was in its government, was quite a forward-thinking liberal canton. And in 1839, they appointed a man called David Strauss to the faculty of the University of Zurich, which just sounds to have a riot over that. But anyway, David Strauss, he was a theologian, but he had progressive views about the life of Christ. To put it in a nutshell, he believed that there was a figure like Christ who existed, and he explored the evidence of his life, but he didn't necessarily believe in the more, shall we say, mythical type elements of his existence, like the miracles and things that are said to have happened at Jesus' instigation, So that's how you would sum it up very simply. But when he was appointed as this member of the university faculty, this inflamed the more rural population of Zurich, the majority were Catholic and, for want of a better word, more conservative in their religious outlook. So there was this quite vicious uprising where the people of rural Zurich attacked the liberal and the cultural thinkers of the government of Zurich at the time. And, it looks like it was quite a bloody uprising, really. There was a botanist called Johannes Jacob who was trying to act as a mediator between the two sides. And unfortunately, he got shot in the head for his efforts and died. Well, I suppose you most people would die after being shot in the head, although it was 3 days later. But anyway, it was quite a bloody uprising. But I suppose I'm mentioning it because it was only a few years before William's in Zurich that this quite bloody political uprising had happened. And I suppose it's sort of intriguing in a way. You could almost say it's this rural population versus the more urban population living in the city of Zurich itself. Now, the next thing I thought I'd discuss is the city of Schaffhausen, or the canton of Schaffhausen. As William describes it, it is an area of land that's in Swiss territory, but it is kind of a little finger sticking out of the north of Switzerland into Germany. So it is surrounded by Germany in 3 of its borders. And apparently in the Second World War, it was actually accidentally bombed in 1944 by the Americans, because it was that close to German territory, and Roosevelt had to write a letter apologising for the mistake. I'm not going to go so much into the history of Schaffhausen itself. It's a very historical city, but as William describes it, it's quite important about its location on the Rhine, close to what he calls the celebrated cataract of Laufen. Now, as I said, that's now known as the Rhine Falls. Pretty well the most famous waterfall in Europe, really. So it's said to be the most powerful waterfall in the whole of Europe, or Western Europe anyway. I call it a sort of mini Niagara Falls, really. But actually what it is it separates the north part of the Rhine from the south, or am I going the other way around? Anyway, or the south part from the north. And, basically you can really navigate through the Rhine Falls. They're so difficult to do that. It'd be impossible to do it. So naturally, a settlement began to be created just on the north side of the falls, where you could unload until you could get round the falls by land and then put stuff back on boats again, or I suppose carry on by horse and cart if you wanted to. So it's really because of its natural closeness to this Rhine Falls that Schaffhausen was created. But these days, the Rhine Falls, you can go there, you can get river trips out on boats to get close to them, a bit like you can on the Niagara Falls. So it's, it's a big tourist attraction. I think there have been attempts over the years to use its power to generate electricity and stuff like that, but they've all been quashed. Yeah, the Rhine Falls, apparently, the average water flow over the Rhine Falls is 600 cubic metres per second. So that's quite a lot. And, you can see there's a great deal of mist generated by these falls as well. So, and it is a big tourist attraction that attracts many people throughout the year to come and see it. And perhaps not surprisingly, in what I would call famous co-travellers of William's at around the same time, who I've mentioned before. Firstly, Turner, not surprisingly, did a painting of the Rhine Falls at a very similar time to when William's there. This particular painting is called The Fall of the Rhine at Schaffhausen, and apparently it's in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, if you ever wanted to take a trip out to see one particular painting. The Rhine Falls, I suppose it's distinct because it has these 2 massive rocks, limestone rocks, in the middle of it that the water flows around. Its creation is due to glaciers and erosion, and it's all very complicated, but I'm sure you could look that up if you're particularly interested in the geography of it. Going back to famous people, and another famous co-traveller of William's, who I've mentioned quite a few times before, was Mary Shelley, and she said of the Rhine Falls, and like William, she uses this word cataract for a waterfall. A portion of the cataract arches over the lowest platform, and the spray fell thickly on us, as standing on it and looking up, we saw wave and rock and cloud, and the clear heavens through its glittering, ever-moving veil. This was a new sight, exceeding anything I had ever seen before. However, not to be wet through, I was obliged quickly to tear myself away. So that's Mary Shelley's impressions of the Rhine Falls. I don't think William actually saw the Rhine Falls from what he says in the journals. He describes them, but he's obviously making his way through Schaffhausen, and I don't think he makes the diversion to see the Rhine Falls, because I'm sure he would have made more of it in the journal, other than just referring to it as the celebrated falls of Laufen. Sorry, this has been quite a long section in this explanation, but it's just the way the journal and the topics that William has covered has meant it's a bit of a long explanatory section for you. But as he's travelling through this part of Baden, or Baden-Württemberg as it's now known. He also mentions the trade of the aerial trades, and he mentions this trade in clocks, and probably like you, most of go, oh, is that cuckoo clocks? And it is. So this area of Germany stroke Switzerland, I think you could call it, because I have to say I immediately associate cuckoo clocks with Switzerland rather than Germany, but you can say both countries really had a long trade in it. But this idea of building these clocks from wood originally comes from this area, and it became quite a big trade. And as William says, they were exported all over the world. Now, actually, as the clocks developed themselves, the actual mechanics, although there were wooden clocks made, the actual mechanics, obviously begin to adopt brass and metal components. So they become more accurate, and it's really just the surrounding part of the clock that's the wooden bit. And in fact, when William's there, it's really just the beginning of the whole cuckoo clock thing. Nobody's quite sure where the origins of having a cuckoo come out of the clock and make that noise originated from. Obviously one maker decided to make a clock and people thought that was good, and then it sort of caught on. But, there is a group of people known as the Black Forest clockmakers of that time. In fact, there's a picture of what they call a Black Forest clock porter. It was someone who walked around with a big clock on his back, I suppose. I don't know whether that was so people could approach him. Well, they wouldn't have to approach him and ask the time. They could just see it on these clocks strapped on his back like a backpack, But, as I say, this whole area did become famous for its clock trade. But it sounds like apparently it says after the American Civil War, the American manufacturers started to make clocks as well, and so the German or northern Swiss trade in clocks was severely impacted by Americans starting to make clocks more competitively, I suppose, and that finally ended its trade. But obviously Switzerland is still famous for its clock manufacturers, but it's this area of very southern Germany, northern Switzerland, southern Germany, where the cuckoo clock came from, and that William is describing when he's there. Back to the journal. Two passes of the Black Forest became particularly noted in the time of the French Revolution, the Canibis and the Cholet, so that translates as Hell's Valley or Hell's Pass. The former, at the foot of the Murg, was taken in 1796. The latter is famous for Moreau's skilful retreat through it in 1796, also known as the Battle of Emmendingen. So this was a battle between the Austrians and the French, and actually one of the major commanders in charge was Moreau, who I mentioned in a previous podcast. And as the French Revolutionary Wars, at this time, when the French Revolutions first started to happen, a lot of the countries around thought, oh, we'll just leave it as a purely internal thing. It began to have wider political implications for the rest of Europe, and France began its expansion, and countries like Austria, or empires like Austria, wanted to restrict it, really. So this Battle of Emmendingen was part of that ongoing campaign. The actual battle itself was fairly evenly matched. No one particularly won. In that sense, the casualties were pretty well equal on both sides. But it did slightly disadvantage the French army, because it meant they had to cross the river further down or higher up. I can't remember which way it was now. But if you want to know more about the Battle of Emmendingen, you can look it up. I don't think it's a particularly famous battle. There isn't a huge amount of detail on it. And I was trying to do a sort of way of just summing it up quickly, and you can't really. But suffice to say, There was a big battle with the French and the Austrians. No one really won, apart from the Austrians maybe slightly came out on top, in the sense that it made the rest of the campaign a little bit more difficult for the French, because they had to logistically move their army somewhere else at a different location. How about that? Okay. Oh dear. As you can tell, I'm not really a military historian, and I don't particularly have ambitions to be one either. The Black Forest abounds in lead, copper, iron, coal, cobalt, some silver, and mineral waters. The woods are also abundant and of excellent quality, both for building houses and vessels navigating the Rhine and Danube. Just as the shades of the evening began to draw around us, we entered the most dismal and rugged part of the forest, and the road was in many places very steep and dangerous. However, it was at the period of the full moon that in some small degree lessened this gloomy place of some of its horrors. We arrived at Freiburg at midnight, where we stopped 2 hours. Freiburg was formerly the capital of the Bresgau, and is now the chief town of the circle of the Dreisam, in the Grand Duchy of Baden, to which Bresgau was ceded to Austria at the Peace of Pressburg in 1805. It's also another name for Bratislava. Freiburg is situated in a romantic district of the Black Forest. Its cathedral is a magnificent edifice, the Gothic steeple of which is 513 feet high. The university, which has some men of distinction amongst its professors and the numbers of students, was established in 1746. This is highly creditable to so small a country as Baden, which contains also the celebrated University of Heidelberg. It contains also a forest academy and a polytechnic school. The city is clean and well built. The spire and light pinnacles, and the beautiful Gothic tracery of the windows of the cathedral, the white houses and public buildings under the lustre of a full moon that nearly equalled it, gave the city a magnificent effect that would be wanting by daylight, and it seemed almost like some city of fairyland as I traversed its streets alone and in the silence of the midnight hour. Okay, I'll just cut in here quickly as well to say that the city of Freiburg that William's describing here is quite historic. Bit of a coincidence, but it actually shares its patron saint with England. So its patron saint is also St. George, and St. George's cross is also in the coat of arms of the city. He did get around St. George. He seems to be patron saint of lots of other places apart from England. It's sort of nestled in this valley, and as William mentions, one of the most distinctive landmarks is this Freiburg minster, or cathedral, which does have this very, very tall spire. It's described as a Gothic cathedral. It's sort of a slightly reddish stone, I would say. William says the tower is 513 feet tall. He's slightly overstating it a bit there, because according to more modern measurements, it's 116 metres, which works out at about 300 feet, not 500. But it still looks pretty impressive. So, perhaps, I don't know, maybe a foot wasn't as long as it is now in William's time. I don't know. Measurement, as I found in the later journals in Mexico, measurement of things is all over the place because a lot of things hadn't been standardised. So it's possible, actually, that, although I say jokingly a foot might have been shorter, it's possible it was slightly, I don't know, an imperial foot. Anyway, the spire itself, it's not solid all the way up. It's actually almost like a kind of tracery of shapes and forms. So it's kind of hollow at its core, but it goes up to a very great height, and it's sort of an octagonal shape which gets sharper and sharper as it reaches its peak. It has been described by the Swiss historian of art and culture, Jakob Burckhardt, as a tower that will forever remain the most beautiful spire on earth. And so sometimes that's misquoted as the most beautiful tower in the whole of Christianity. So, not sure I'd agree, to be honest, but it's nice. Certainly a lot of very difficult work for the masons, actually, to have put it together in the way that they did. And that's really about it. It was heavily bombed during the Second World War, actually, and it was a bad raid in which the Germans accidentally bombed it themselves, and then there was a very heavy raid called, I think it was called Tiger, by the RAF, which severely bombed Freiburg as well, and much of the centre of the town was destroyed, although luckily the actual cathedral itself did survive, but a lot of the city has been rebuilt since the Second World War, although they've, as they amazingly do, have kind of reconstructed it as it was, and also with a similar layout to the medieval town. Sometimes you go to parts of Europe, it's remarkable how things were rebuilt in the way they existed before they were bombed to smithereens in the Second World War. I suppose it's, as I say, the most notable thing about it is this very tall, spired church. Not the tallest in Germany, because I think the tallest might be one in a place called Ulm, U-L-M, and I've actually visited that town and I've actually seen that spire as well on a work trip. Now that may well be 513 feet tall. March 23rd. Left Freiburg at 2 a.m. and arrived at Offenburg, a considerable town where we stopped to breakfast. The country from this place was tolerably level, the villages very numerous and large, the houses apparently very comfortable, and bearing a great resemblance to those in the north of England, formed of a framework of wood, and then filled in with lath and plaster, which is whitewashed, and the woodwork painted a dark colour, which gives them a rather grotesque appearance. A great many orchards well filled with fruit trees surrounded the houses and villages, and immense stacks of firewood stood in all directions. The peasantry were plainly but warmly clad. Most of them wear large three-cornered cocked hats, which gives them to a stranger a rather ridiculous appearance. The next place we passed through of any importance was Baden, from whence the duchy takes its name. Though not the capital, it was during 600 years the residence of the Margraves of Baden, and is situated in a charming valley about 2 leagues from the Rhine. The castle at Baden affords from all sides the most splendid prospects. It contains a number of subterranean vaults, which according to tradition served as the seat of the secret court of the criminal justice called the Vermergerichten. It's also known as the Wehrmich Court. The Hall of Antiquities contains Roman monuments which had been found in the vicinity. The college church of the Jesuits is distinguished by the sepulchres of the Margraves. It has 6 altarpieces painted by Lille after Guido Reni. So actually Lille, I kind of guessed that name, I couldn't quite make it out in the original handwritten script, but Guido Reni, I think that's how you say it, lived from 1575 to 1642. He actually became pretty well the most famous painter in Italy at that time. Baden contains 418 houses and has 26 mineral springs, the principal of which is even now covered with Carrara marble, and was probably a Roman bath. Population 3,200. The next place we passed through was Rastatt, a considerable town situated on the banks of the river Merg, a short distance from the Rhine. It contains several handsome buildings and churches, population 5,000. We next passed through Ettlingen, adjoining to which is a fine hunting seat and park belonging to the Grand Duke, and at length reached Karlsruhe at 5:30 in the evening, very much fatigued, and after partaking of dinner retired early to rest. Right, so I thought I'd catch up at this point on a few things that William said in this section. Firstly, he refers to these 3-cornered cocked hats looking fairly comical. I think they're fairly traditional hats that people would have worn at that time. There are very distinctive hats worn in that area that do date back to about this time, and they're called the Bollen Hut, we would say in English, but I think it's called Bojenhut in German, and these are very much traditional dress that's often featured that young ladies wear in the area, and Bullen hat means bull hats, and they have these great big either red or black pom-poms put on the hat on the top, made of wool. Red ones are for unmarried women and black ones are worn by married women. They tend to be traditionally worn by the Protestant women in that area of the Black Forest, although I think some Catholic people do wear them as well, but they were traditionally a Protestant dress. And they're centred around 3 villages in the Black Forest as well. That's where their origins particularly come from, but now they've grown to represent the whole of the Black Forest's traditional dress or headgear. They date back to about 1800, just about before 1797, so they would have been around when William was doing his travelling, but I think they really only worn on ceremonial occasions like weddings and festival days, so I don't think they'd be everyday wear. And they are quite curious looking. Over the years, the balls have got larger and larger and more flamboyant, but that is a traditional hat, but don't think that's what William's referring to. The next thing I thought I'd just explain, because he does mention these people a couple of times, the Margraves, or Margrave dates back to medieval times and the Holy Roman Empire, and a Margrave was a ruler of an area of the Holy Roman Empire, so another word for a military commander who was given the role to defend a certain area of the Holy Roman Empire. And after a while, in some cases, it became a hereditary title as well. They were designated in their area from the Holy Roman Emperor himself. And because they were essentially often on the border areas of the Holy Roman Empire, they actually had quite a lot of autonomy, and they could, in fact, be, in the times of the Middle Ages, they could actually become quite powerful rulers themselves of their area. The title or role eventually ended with the end of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. The next thing I thought I'd mention that William discusses is these courts. He calls them Femegericht, which is one way of saying it. They're also known as the Vehemic courts, Vehemic. So William refers to them in this section. Basically, Vehemic courts, another term for them is silent court or forbidden court. And they consisted of people who were chosen amongst a group of the local areas, great and good, I suppose you'd say, or, justice of the peace type people, who would get together and then pass judgment on a person. They were quite serious because it was often a matter of life and death. So if you were on the wrong side of their judgment, then it would literally be curtains for you. But they gained quite a bad reputation as being pretty harsh and fierce. But the thing about them is they were held in silence, or more accurately, secret. And then the judgment was finally made, and you were either set free or you were for the chop. It has been suggested that they were merciless, and actually what they might do, if you were the wrong end of their judgment, they'd let you go and give you a head start, and then you'd be tracked down and hunted to death by the court, or people instructed by the court to do that. So, as I say, they gained this quite nasty reputation. Actually, some of that apparently has been countered now, and most people don't think they were that bad. But that's the Vehemic court, or Femegericht. I think William calls it Femegerichten, but I've mainly seen it referred to as Femegericht court, or Fem court, or Vehemic court. The last thing I thought I'd talk a little bit more about is this artist Guido Reni, who, as I said, became very, very famous in his time. He lived from 1575 to 1642, and he was an Italian Baroque painter. But he did really become well known in his time. Probably this is why he was being copied by this other artist that William mentions, whose name I could never quite fully decipher from the pages of the original journal. Like many artists of that time, he painted a lot of biblical scenes. There's quite a dramatic one of St. Michael stamping on Satan's head, which apparently is in the Santa Maria della Concezione di Cappuccini in Rome. That dates back to 1636. I'd say what he is quite good at doing is old men. He gets the beard and their greying hair, rather like my own these days. He gets that very nicely. There's a picture here of St. Joseph and the Christ child, and it's a very kindly looking elderly Joseph looking down on a chubby little Jesus. There's definitely a lot of warmth in the face of Joseph there. He was very influential in his time. There's one picture of his, David with the head of Goliath, where obviously Goliath's head is pretty massive compared to David. I don't know why, though. David's wearing... It's quite a sort of grey picture, but David is wearing this rather fetching red hat with a big yellow and blue feather in it, and not much else. I don't know quite what the significance of the dainty hat is, considering he's just chopped Goliath's head off. Another good old man is St. Matthew and the Angel. That's a good one. A very wistful-looking St. James the Greater. I thought he was Jesus at first, but he's very wistfully looking up at something. I don't know. Maybe he's got a sort of expression of, I think I've left the gas on. I don't know. Anyway, that's St. James. And I have to say, there's one... I know we shouldn't really laugh at old paintings, but there's one entitled Bacchus and Ariadne, painted around 1619. And I don't know, they're both naked, as you could imagine, and Ariadne is draped on this rock on a lovely yellow silk blanket affair with suitably draped light green sheets around her nether regions as well. But I don't know, the pair of them really both look like they've had a bit of an argument, but I really shouldn't do this, but the expression on her face as a naked Bacchus stands there looking at her accusingly with his, I have to say, not exactly impressive on display. I mean, to be honest, it looks a bit like a walnut. Is quite comical. I would suggest Ariadne, she's got her hand up pointing in the direction of the aforementioned walnut. And it's sort of an expression of, what am I supposed to do with this? on her face. So anyway, I don't know. It's very easy to make fun of these sort of old paintings, but I do think from a modern perspective, Bacchus and Ariadne by Guido Reni. It's in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I'd suggest Googling that one and having a look. It's just the expression on their faces, really. It's not exactly religious, I would say. It's like a modern-day married couple who've had a bit of a tiff. Any thoughts or interpretations of what you think's going on between the two of them there would be most welcome. Do get in touch if you've got any ideas different from mine. Okay, so I'm going to end the episode here, as William and his family have just reached Karlsruhe. I think that's the correct way of pronouncing it. So quite a lot of things in that last episode. I apologise if the explanatory bits were a bit long. As I've said, it's just the way the topics that William had written about in the journal came in the narrative, and the things that I decided would be of interest to talk about. I'm not so sure. Knowing about the Wehrmacht court is that interesting, but sometimes you get passages in the journal that are not exactly inspiring, and maybe there were elements in this last episode that were a little bit like that, where it was quite hard to find things that triggered my interest, apart from the interesting art of Guido Reni, of course, which did tickle my fancy, as they say. As I've often said before, I do try and edit particularly repetitive bits out of the journal if I can, or bits that do seem just not very interesting, or sometimes there's quite long stretches of history that William writes about, which I'm sure he's getting from some sort of reference book himself, and so it's almost like repetition, me then talking about it, him talking about it, and then me talking about it as well. And sometimes it's quite easy just to sum up the information about those places quicker than William does. But I hope you enjoyed the episode anyway. Perhaps not the most sparkling, but you've got to take the rough with the smooth, haven't you? It can't be all bells and whistles and balloons. As I said at the beginning, if you do want to make contact, there's those ways that I mentioned through X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook, if you want. And as I've said before, if there's something you sort of disagree with, or there's something that you can expand on that I've mentioned in the podcast, by all means do. It's great, and I hopefully can then also mention that in the podcast too. It's always great to get other people's sort of knowledge or experience of things. For example, if anyone has been to the Rhine Falls and they can tell me a little bit more about that experience and what it was like, That'd be great because I've never been there myself personally. As I've said before, I would love to do a trip following William's travels myself at some point. I don't think I can follow him exactly step by step, but certain highlights. I would like to maybe get to Milan one day and certainly explore some of the sights and sounds that he saw there that are still existing today from his time. Just to let you know a little bit about the next episode. So basically, William is in Karlsruhe and he does quite a long explanation of that city. And then they continue their journey onto Heidelberg and then Mannheim. And when they get to Mannheim, that's when they actually start travelling themselves by steamboat up the Rhine, which I was sure that they had done. But up until that point, the Rhine isn't broad enough or deep enough for steamboats to navigate it, or this section of it anyway isn't. So that's when William and his family get on a steamboat and continue their journey up through Germany. So really, that is it. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you do get a chance to look up the picture of Bacchus and Ariadne, by all means do. Let me know what you think they're thinking in that picture. That would be great. As I say, to modernise their expressions look somewhat puzzling, I think. Anyway, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. If it's your first time listening, do come back, do tell your friends to try it, do subscribe. And if you're a regular listener, very, very many thanks for tuning in again. And I look forward to welcoming you to episode 33. So that's it. If you have been, thanks for listening.